The bottom line of today's episode is simple. The New Orleans Saints are going to be just fine. We got all of that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net and Saints analyst with WWL TV. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, I'm going to tell you why Joe Brady, offensive coordinator for the Buffalo Bills, is still my favorite candidate for the New Orleans Saints head coaching job. I'll tell you what a little bit of that could look like. We're going to dive into the interviews being rescheduled for the New Orleans Saints and why it's going to be okay. It's not going to cost the New Orleans Saints anything to reschedule their interviews with this ongoing snowstorm here in Louisiana. And we're going to kick everything off here with a look at Aaron Glenn. The watch is on as he visits with the New York Jets today. But what happens if he ends up taking that job and the Saints can't hire him? We got all that on today's episode. We appreciate you, whether it's your first time or your next time, for making us your first listen and for being it every day. You're here on the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode brought to you by our friends over at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off of your first purchase. The New York Jets could hire Detroit Lions defensive coordinator Aaron Glenn today, and thereby keep the New Orleans Saints from even getting the opportunity to host him for an in-person interview. But here's the thing, if that happens, and that is the case, the Saints will be okay. That's the theme of today's episode. The Saints will be okay. It's interesting all the time to watch like people's viewpoints on a candidate like Aaron Glenn drop off after a game and a loss to the Washington Commanders. But then the same group of people kind of come up and then say, well, if Aaron Glenn chooses the New York Jets, then the Saints are going to have to settle for somebody else. So it's funny the way that those conversations go. But here's the real situation. Do the Saints highly value Aaron Glenn? Yes. Would the Saints like to hire Aaron Glenn? I imagine so. Is Aaron Glenn their only number one option, like best option? Also, no. The New Orleans Saints have several options that they like, and there are several options that we like more than others within those options. But the Saints are going to be in a situation where even if they have to pivot because Aaron Glenn gets hired elsewhere by the New York Jets, they're still not in a situation to where they're necessarily settling depending upon who they hire and what happens next. Here's the way that I look at it. Tier 1 for the New Orleans Saints consists of Aaron Glenn, Joe Brady, the offensive coordinator of the Buffalo Bills, and then I put Cliff Kingsbury of the Washington Commanders up there. I get it. He failed as a head coach elsewhere, but that doesn't mean that he'll fail as a head coach again, and especially somebody that has continued to grow and learn the way that he has. I thought he was treated like a little bit of a scapegoat in Arizona anyway, so I get it. For the Saints, you probably take Kingsbury out and you probably put McCarthy in. For me, tier 2, I've got Mike McCarthy. Then I've got Anthony Weaver. Then tier 3, I've got Kellen Moore and Mike Kafka at the lower tier on this conversation, because I think Weaver's really good. Oh, excuse me, not Weaver. Not Weaver. Sorry, I've got Weaver in tier 2. Tier 3, I have Kellen Moore and Mike Kafka. Kellen Moore, I think, is a really good offensive coordinator, but there's nothing out there that tells me that he would be a very good head coach. And then Kafka, to me, is a guy that you hire and then probably go back to the market in a couple of years after you've got like a better situation and stuff like that. And then Darren Rizzi, I would put probably in either tier 1 or tier 2 of this conversation for New Orleans, because he kind of represents an opportunity to have that CEO head coach build out your coordinators, let them go out there and coordinate. So I'd probably put Rizzi in tier 2. So looking at it, if Aaron Glenn ends up taking the New York Jets job, the Saints are in a good position to still land one of their top guys, should those top guys be a collection of Joe Brady, Darren Rizzi, Cliff Kingsbury, and of course, Mike McCarthy. And there's not really a lot of competition for those guys either at the moment. So the Saints are in a good position when it comes to this. Here's the facts, right? And this is a thing that we've known, and Locked On Saints insiders have been told this since the final game, after the final whistle, that Aaron Glenn probably prefers the Jets job. I mean, I've been saying that for weeks, and we've known this for weeks. Aaron Glenn probably prefers the Jets job. Why? He was a personnel scout with them, which is a thing that no one ever talks about. One of the reasons why a lot of teams like Aaron Glenn isn't just because he's a former player and a defensive coordinator and a successful coach, but because he's also got scouting experience. Not a lot of head coaching candidates have scouting experience. And that's big to be able to come in and evaluate talent. We've seen the New Orleans Saints struggle to evaluate talent at particular positions, linebacker, quarterback, right? And I'm going all the way back to like 2006 and then moving forward. And so for the Saints, you can see why that would be very appealing. But for Aaron Glenn, it makes him appealing to other teams too. Here's the thing about the Jets job. So not only was he a personnel assistant there, but he was also, of course, drafted there in the first round, 12th overall, I believe it was 1994, if I remember correctly. So he's got a long-standing history there. And it's also the New York Jets, who have been dismal in the recent history of the NFL, but in the long history of the NFL, it's one of the most historied franchises. And if you can become the coach that turns around the New York Jets, you'll probably have a very successful coaching career, right? Or at least you'll be remembered for having a very successful coaching career. The other thing is, the Jets have an open general manager position. And this is where things get a little bit interesting, right? Because there is someone out there, Newmark, who has been working as an executive with the Washington Commanders, but was a long-time 20-plus year executive with the Detroit Lions. Aaron Glenn likes Newmark. And so if the Jets were to hire him, Newmark, as their new general manager, and then turn around and hire Aaron Glenn, it puts Aaron Glenn in a situation to where he has a general manager that he has worked with recently that he wants to continue to work with. It's a perfect situation, and a situation that New Orleans cannot offer because of the stability at general manager and at owner. So that's okay. The Saints might have to pivot, but they're not yet in a situation where they have to settle. Now, if Aaron Glenn takes a job, and then all of a sudden Mike McCarthy takes a job, and then for whatever reason Joe Brady takes a different job, then all of a sudden the New Orleans Saints are in a situation to where they're settling for something, right? Because there's nothing that says that Kingsbury necessarily will leave Washington. And then you've got Weaver, who's probably a year away. You've got Kellen Moore, who I think, again, better coordinator than coach. And then you've got Kafka, who, look, I understand the appeal of Kafka because of the Andy Reid connection. He's the guy that's going to show up, play funny clips at the beginning of of team meetings and things like that, and have a really good relationship with the roster, and will build a player first culture that will have to be led by the team captains. And so there's a lot of passing the buck to the players in those situations, and isn't going to win anybody over at the podium. It's going to be very Dennis Allen-like. And so I think the New Orleans Saints should avoid that. And so that's when you're in a situation to where you're settling. But even then, you could go back to Darren Rizzi. So the Saints are not in a situation to where if Aaron Glenn does take the job with the New York Jets, which I'm not going to lie to you, seems pretty likely, right? Based on everything that we've been saying, based on everything that we've been hearing, seems likely that could be the case. And if it is, though, Saints will be okay. They can still get one of their top options, because most of the other top options they're running uncontested for. That's what I want to get to next, because the New Orleans Saints are going to have to change their interview schedule. And that, too, will not cause them much grief because of the fact that they're running uncontested for a lot of their top candidates. Let's get to that next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends over at Game Time, the best place to go and buy your tickets, whether you're purchasing moments in advance or months in advance. Game Time is awesome. One of my favorite things that they have is Game Time Picks, which is a curated menu that gives you their best deals so that you don't have to sort through thousands and thousands of tickets, because that's the selection that you have over at Game Time. They also give you a lot of transparency as well. You can toggle on all-in pricing so you're not taken by surprise by a bunch of fees by the time you get to checkout. And they also show you views from your seats. So they take the guesswork out of buying tickets as a whole, and you can do the same by heading over to Game Time today. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL. You're going to get $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. That's promo code LOCKEDONNFL on the Game Time app for $20 off of your first purchase. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. All right, family. According to several reports, the New Orleans Saints are going to be rescheduling some of their head coach interviews that were supposed to take place today and tomorrow, Tuesday and Wednesday, and potentially looking as deep into the week as Friday and Saturday to hold those interviews. Here's the thing, right? And the reason why they're doing that is because there's a whole snowstorm going on. It is covered in snow outside here. It's kind of crazy. So happy snow day to everybody that might be hunkering down and enjoying the show. If you're here in Louisiana, the New Orleans Saints in that situation are not going to be kind of hamstrung at all by this. Let me explain to you why. Let's go kind of candidate by candidate for the most part, and I'll explain why this isn't a big deal, right? You think about the interviews the Saints were supposed to have this week. Mike Kafka, Anthony Weaver, they were supposed to be Kafka today, Weaver tomorrow, Glenn tomorrow. Darren Rizzi was supposed to be sometime this week, as I understand it, and then Mike McCarthy was scheduling with the Saints. So here's the deal. Let's focus on those 5 to start. So the Aaron Glenn decision precedes anything anyway. It doesn't matter, right? Aaron Glenn takes a job with the New York Jets on Tuesday. It doesn't matter if the Saints were scheduled to interview Aaron Glenn on Wednesday or interview Aaron Glenn on Friday. It doesn't make any difference because Aaron Glenn took the New York Jets job on Tuesday, hypothetically, right? So like it doesn't put the Saints in a bad situation if they end up with it. The one exception would be, let's say that Aaron Glenn does not get the New York Jets job, which at the time that I'm recording this presently at 10:30 a.m., he has not been, the news has not broken that he has accepted that job at this time or that a job has been extended or anything like that. We'll see what happens by the time that I actually publish this episode, so forgive me. But the fact of the matter is that if he takes the job on Tuesday, the Saints wouldn't have had a shot at him on Wednesday. So it doesn't matter, right? So that Aaron Glenn decision and situation is not impacted by you having to delay. Here's the exception that I was starting to get to before I sidetracked myself. If Aaron Glenn doesn't take the job with the New York Jets, but then he goes and says, well, since I can't go to New Orleans until Friday or Saturday, I'm going to the Jaguars to do an interview there, even though the Jaguars seem really, really set on Liam Cohen, the offensive coordinator from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, which, hey, good riddance, get out of the NFC South. Like that would be a good thing for New Orleans. Then he could go to Jacksonville and maybe be swooned by Jacksonville, but I doubt that. In which case, I think he would still have the opportunity to interview in New Orleans. So pushing Aaron Glenn's interview back doesn't have an impact for New Orleans, more than likely, unless the Jags somehow swoop in. Mike McCarthy's was already scheduling while everyone knew about the weather predicament. So there was never a set date for Mike McCarthy because the Saints were scheduling with Mike McCarthy going, hey, we don't know what the weather situation is going to be. Can we fly you in? Can we not fly you in? So we might have to push towards later in the week. But they're planning on doing an interview, and the plan is still to do an interview at this time. It was never scheduled, so it won't ever be pushed back because in the midst of scheduling it, they were already aware that the inclement weather situation could be a part of it. So no impact on that. And remember, Mike McCarthy's big opportunity elsewhere was with Chicago, and Chicago just hired Ben Johnson on Monday night, meaning that the Saints are effectively running uncontested if they want Mike McCarthy. Good news for them. As for Kafka and Weaver, not a lot of competition there, right? Also kind of running uncontested for both of those guys. Those guys are not top options as we're hearing it from other organizations and stuff like that. Although Kafka to Las Vegas could be a fit. The Dallas Cowboys are kind of doing their own little search. They're talking to like the Brian Schottenheimers of the world and like all these other things. There's the Deion Sanders of it all and everything. So they're kind of doing their own thing. And if you're competing with the Jaguars seem pretty kind of honed in on a guy like Liam Cohen. So far, so good, right? So even if those were your guys, which I think Anthony Weaver is still a good coach. Like I actually wouldn't mind an Anthony Weaver hire. I think he's going to be a good coach in the NFL. He just might need a little bit more time. But you're running uncontested for both of those guys. And then Darren Rizzi is in your facility. So, hey, can you come over to the next room, please? Come on. That'll be fine. That'll be fine. So for those candidates, Glenn, McCarthy, Kafka, Weaver, Rizzi, pushing back towards the end of the week doesn't really have a negative impact. The Saints would be okay. The only negative thing really that can come from this is Aaron Glenn taking the New York Jets job, in which case you wouldn't have gotten a shot at him anyway. So it doesn't matter. Now let's look at the other remaining candidates. Buffalo Bills offensive coordinator Joe Brady, one of my favorites in this group. Washington Commanders offensive coordinator Cliff Kingsbury, and then Kellen Moore, the offensive coordinator of the Philadelphia Eagles. Well, all three of those coaches are coaching a conference championship game this weekend, right? The Bills will be taking on the Kansas City Chiefs, and then Moore's Eagles will be hosting Kingsbury's Commanders. So none of them can interview this week anyway. And the next time that they would be available to interview or eligible to interview would be in the bye week between the championship game and the Super Bowl. So basically, like during the Senior Bowl week, and could potentially even do it in Mobile, depending upon who is where. Although I would expect probably Mickey stays in New Orleans. You bring people to New Orleans, and then other folks like Jeff Ireland and his team go to Mobile. But we'll see exactly what happens there. But because they're coaching in a championship game, conference championship games anyway, the idea of an inclement weather delay, again, does not matter because they wouldn't be able to interview in person with you anyway until after the inclement weather situation. So again, the Saints will be okay, right? Like if Aaron Glenn chooses the Jets, they have several other top candidates. If you have to delay into Friday and Saturday for these interviews, you're fine because you're running uncontested mostly for Mike McCarthy. You're running uncontested for some of the other guys. And then your top offensive coordinator group, Moore, Brady, Kingsbury, none of them can interview with you until then. And then Rizzy's already in your building. So for me, like, it's not that big of a deal. It's not that big of a deal. The one tricky part is if some team swings in and somehow convinces McCarthy to sign with them, or somehow convinces Glenn to sign with them, not sign, but to take a job with them if he doesn't take the Jets job and all that. But more than likely, if he's not with the Saints, it's because he took the Jets job anyway. So it doesn't matter if his interview is scheduled for Wednesday of this week or Wednesday of next week. If he takes the job on Tuesday, you never had a run at him. So all in all, Saints will be okay. Does it stink a little bit? Yeah. Is it inconvenient? Yeah, sure. Right? Like the Saints looked like they were going to be full steam ahead on their head coaching search, knowing that there were still three candidates that they couldn't interview along the way, but that they still planned to interview. That's another key thing. Albert Breer of Sports Illustrated reported that guys like Moore, guys like Brady are going to get or are expected to get second interviews. I think the one thing that would change that is if Glenn says, hey, I'm the guy, then maybe things change there. But other than that, and it's a good thing that the Saints are wanting to give those candidates a second interview because for me personally, in my brand, Joe Brady is one of my favorite candidates in this class. Let's discuss, or in this cycle, let's discuss why he's one of my favorite hires, why I think the Saints should hire him, and who he could bring along and have beside him to help make this team more successful in the short term. Let's get to that next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by friends over at Prize Picks, the best place to go to play daily fantasy sports. No having to deal with injuries, no having to deal with bad trade requests from other people in your league, no mystery lineups. It's you and your knowledge of your favorite teams, your favorite players, your favorite game versus the house. Prize Picks gives you players and then gives those players projections. All you have to do is pick 2 to 6 players and choose whether or not they're going to come out at more or less than their Prize Picks projection. 230 passing yards from Jared Goff, more or less. I went with more for division weekend. Boom, walked away with a win on that. Then you take a look at like Saquon Barkley, 1 touchdown, more or less. Took more, boom, walked away with a big win on that. I cleaned up on Prize Picks during the division round. I'm just going to be honest with you. So you can go check them out today over at Prize Picks. And right now, Locked On NFL listeners get a special offer. Download the Prize Picks app today and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL. You're going to get $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. It's $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup with the promo code LOCKEDONNFL. It's Prize Picks. Run your game. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Appreciate you being here with us on a snow day here in Louisiana. What a wild time. In case you missed it, yesterday's episode was awesome. I love doing yesterday's episode. We did a mock draft Monday, 3 mock drafts with 3 different head coaches. We're going to do more of that and thinking about things like offensive coordinator hires, defensive coordinator hires, depending upon who the head coach ends up being and stuff like that. So we'll do more of that. Big shout out to Eric Bro for the fantastic idea on that. So make sure you go and check that out if you're looking for other things to check out today. while you're hunkering down and trying to stay warm. Hope you and your families are well. I want to tell you why Joe Brady is honestly my favorite hire in this coaching cycle. He really is. Look, I think the Saints love Aaron Glenn. They want Aaron Glenn, all those other things. I can see the value of a Mike McCarthy. I put him in tier 2, but really like he's at the top of tier 2. He could be a tier 1 guy. I understand the value, right? A guy that has a career winning record, that is a Super Bowl coaching champion. Odds are in the NFL that if you've won a Super Bowl, you're more likely to win another Super Bowl than the other guy that's never won a Super Bowl is likely to win a Super Bowl and all those other things. Like we've seen that over and over again. And so, like, I get it. I understand all that. But man, I can't get past this little itch in the back of my head that just says Joe Brady, Joe Brady, Joe Brady. And the reason why is because Joe Brady is the type of coach that I'd like for a team in a situation like New Orleans. He's young, he's innovative, he's somebody that puts and utilizes the input of his players in order to design what it is that he's doing. He does a good job of doing things and changing things to the strengths of the players. I mean, look at Buffalo from last year to this year and what happened when Ken Dorsey was fired over in Buffalo and when Joe Brady stepped in as the interim head coach. He didn't change a ton about the offense, but what he did was that he changed the mentality of that offense. He changed the way that players are being utilized. Everybody eats is the moniker. I love that. I love that. Everybody eats. It's something I've always said. It's why I always try to support like other podcasts and all this stuff, because as far as I'm concerned, everybody eats. And that's great. And I love that mentality for a team. The other thing I like about him, and people don't talk about this a ton because, to be fair, it was 1 year, it was at William & Mary, but he was also a linebackers coach at one point. So he knows a little bit about coaching defense and all these other things, has the ability to be able to kind of speak that language. And I think that coaching linebackers in particular is a really, really good and intensive way to learn how to coach a defense, because linebackers have to do it all. They have to cover. They have to defend the run. They have to communicate. They have to quarterback the defense. They have to make adjustments. They have to make checks. They have to adjust based on the fact that the offense is adjusting. They have to rush the passer. They have to tackle. You got to do everything as a linebacker, right? Like linebackers, tight ends, those guys do everything available for their unit on the field. And a lot of those linebackers also play on special teams. So I think that there's something there too. So I think that a little bit of that experience, much like we were talking about with Aaron Glenn, having a couple years of scouting experience, 1 year of experience as a general manager for an indoor football team as well, with the Houston Stallions and the SIFL or the IFL or whatever, that has value when it comes to these teams. Players love him, which I think is an important one for me too. And he has proven to be a guy that can get the most out of his quarterbacks. Now, I know that Carolina was an exception there, but watching the growth potential from his days in Carolina to his days in Buffalo, seeing the success he was able to get with Joe Burrow and all those other things, like these are the things that you look at and you go, okay, you can see the growth, you can see the trajectory, you can see the upward momentum. That's what you're looking for one of these coaches, and in particular these young coaches in the league. I am not somebody that is a believer that offensive coaches are better than defensive coaches, but I am somebody who believes that offensive coaches are more convenient than defensive head coaches. Why? Because of the turnover of offensive coaches in the NFL and the turnover of offensive coordinators in the NFL, I should say. You bring in a guy like Joe Brady, you don't have to rehire a new offensive coordinator every time that you find a little bit of success with a new offensive coordinator. Your offense stays the same as long as that head coach is calling that offense. It was part of what made the longevity of success with Sean Payton. Joe Brady is not Sean Payton. Sean Payton is not Joe Brady. That is not what I'm saying. But that is looking at the New Orleans Saints history. That's part of what made the longevity of success possible for New Orleans, is because they found their success through their offense. Remember, their defense was atrocious for many years and everything under Sean Payton. But the offense was the difference maker. And then in 2017, everything changed in terms of how successful the defense became, what Dennis Allen was able to do with the defense, the draft classes of 2016 and 2017, the benefits they had on both sides of the ball, particularly 2017, and the impact it had on defense, yada, 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 right? So I think that becomes the next thing too, is you get a really, really solid offense that knows how to produce, that knows how to play to its players' strengths, that knows how to build on what it is that you're trying to build on, and knows how to develop talent, right? James Cook, you look at the way that guys Tight ends have been utilized in that Buffalo offense, even though they've had really good tight ends for some time. Guys like Dawson Knox and Dalton Kincaid, seeing the usage of those guys, looking at the wide receivers. They don't have a big name wide receiver. They traded for Amari Cooper, but Amari Cooper has not been the guy in Buffalo because everyone eats. Everyone's been the guy in Buffalo. And sure, it helps to have an MVP candidate as your quarterback, but I refuse to ding a coach that does a good thing with a good player as if the Saints are going to look at that and go, you know what? He did a really good job with Josh Allen, but we don't intend to have a good quarterback ever, so that's not going to work. No one does that. No one is doing that. Why are we knocking some guy's evaluation because he did good things with a good player? It doesn't make any sense. Go out there and get him a good player. Duh. Like, let's chill. You know what I mean? And so for me, when I look at how you build around a Joe Brady, I think one of the key things beyond getting him as quarterback, and I still love Drew Aller in next year's draft. I think we'll see how he develops over 2025, right? If he's not good in 2025 at Penn State, then obviously not a good option. But a better quarterback class on the way in 2026, and probably a better free agency class on the way. And you still have talent to develop here in New Orleans and Spencer Rattler, Jake Haener, and you'll see where things go with Derek Carr, who, when the offense worked, played well. Sorry to say it. I know people hate hearing it, but played well. Do I think that he's the future in New Orleans? No. But do I think he could be 2025 in New Orleans? Yeah. And so can you do something with him, right? And then change over to your young quarterback after that, whether that's a new drafted quarterback or one of the guys in the building. So I think you got to figure out the quarterback situation. No doubt about it. But I also think that pairing him with a veteran defensive coordinator would be a huge success in New Orleans as well, right? Because again, you want to have that defense to be able to kind of help you support the young coach that's figuring things out, learning on the job, all those other things. You got to have patience in that situation. And New Orleans would have patience. So guys like Wink Martindale that are out there, Robert Saleh, who's out there if he doesn't take the head coaching job in Jacksonville. Remember, Liam Cohen seems to be the guy that Jacksonville's really focusing on, but Robert Saleh is a front runner there too. And so if Robert Saleh ends up having to take a defensive coordinator job somewhere and doesn't go back to San Francisco, man, would he be a good hire here in New Orleans? You know what I mean? And would Joe Brady be able to pull that off? Would Mickey Loomis be able to pull that off? I don't know, right? But you get what I'm saying. The veteran defensive coordinator that does unique things, that brings a new sort of vantage point of defense to New Orleans in the process, right? Wink Martindale is an insane defensive play caller. It's awesome. All those things. That's the big thing that I think you would also have to put next to Joe Brady, or could find a lot of success with if you put that next to Joe Brady. And by the way, have Ronald Curry come back to New Orleans as Joe Brady's offensive coordinator, and then try to keep Andrew Janocko in place as well. And then you've got a humongously good quarterback development room, which would be awesome. So yeah, I'm all about Joe Brady. Like I know the Saints love Aaron Glenn. I know the Saints value Mike McCarthy. I'm all about Joe Brady personally. Not that either of those other hires would be bad hires per se, but man, would I be excited about a Joe Brady hire until it either did or didn't work, right? But man, I would love to see it. I would love to learn. I'd love to find out. So that's what I want to see here in New Orleans. So I just wanted to explain why Joe Brady's at the top of my list personally. Even though that might not be the case for the New Orleans Saints. All right, y'all, coming up in tomorrow's episode, did Aaron Glenn take a job with the New York Jets? Are the New Orleans Saints in trouble? We'll dive into all of it in tomorrow's episode. We appreciate you very much, as always, for making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me in the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media, at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you living. Let me know how you momming them. The Trust Who Dat Nation. I'll holla at you.